All right, our next realm is the Middle American realm. And the Middle American realm is primarily Mexico, but in addition to Mexico, a handful of other countries in Central America and the Caribbean Ocean, or the Caribbean Sea, I should say. Before we get into the chapter, I do want to remind you that you should know all of the concepts, ideas, and terms outlined in the chapter when you do your reading. These are from the previous edition of the book, and I think the current edition is a bit longer, but you'll see that they're in the beginning of the chapter, and they're also highlighted as you read the text. So I've underlined a few here that we'll cover in lecture, but make sure you understand the remaining ones as well. Now, the Middle American realm, we can divide it into 3 regions, and then one can be subdivided. So let's go over those right now. We have the region of Mexico. The country of Mexico itself is the dominant, largest country in this realm. So it deserves its own region. In fact, we'll probably be mostly talking about Mexico. Then there's a collection of countries that make up Central America. And I do want to, maybe I want to pause there and note that we're talking about something kind of, there's some similar terminology here. The name of the realm is Middle America. However, within Middle America is the distinct area called Central America. So Middle, Central, sounds similar, but Central America is a very agreed upon geographic term describing this collection of countries between Mexico and South America, including Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and Costa Rica, and Belize. Missed one there. Okay, so we have Mexico, and then south of Mexico, we have Central America, and then we have the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, we can divide that into 2 parts. One is the Greater Antilles, actually 4 islands: the island of Cuba, the island of Jamaica, the island of Hispaniola, which includes both Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and then the island of Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory. Then there's a whole bunch of other islands, and this collection of other islands are called the Lesser Antilles. So let's talk about population patterns briefly. By far the largest country is Mexico, with over 100 million people. And after that, in Central America, the largest country is Guatemala, with only 17 million people. You can see that's a big difference between Guatemala and Mexico. So over 100 million, just under 20 million. In the Caribbean islands, the most populated is Cuba. However, one thing I will point out on this chart here, this is showing the population of Cuba, just over 11 million, and then the population of Dominican Republic, just under 11 million. But if you look at the trend line, you can see that it appears that at some point in the future, the Dominican Republic will outpace the population of Cuba because Cuba has slower population growth. So one day I'm going to give this lecture, I'm going to have to update the slide. And looking at the country of Mexico itself, one thing I want to highlight here is that this is showing the cities of, the urban area population. And this big one is over 200 million. And that is right here, Mexico City. Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the world. So obviously it's going to be the biggest city of this realm. And in fact, it is, one of the biggest cities in the whole world. All right, in the Caribbean Basin, we have the Greater Antilles, which is Cuba, Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Dominican Republic. We have Jamaica, we have Puerto Rico, and then the rest are part of the Lesser Antilles. They reach all the way down to the coast of South America. All right, so yeah, to zoom in here, this is a figure we'll talk about later showing some of the colonial spheres of the Middle America And this is the island of Hispaniola. And while it is one island, it has two countries. And part of that is because Haiti was a former French colony and the Dominican Republic was part of the Spanish Empire. So as each one of them gained independence at different times and became independent countries, even though they share a single island. And a couple of other general geographic terms I want introduction is the concept of an archipelago and the concept of an isthmus. An archipelago is a good description of the Caribbean islands. It refers to a chain of islands, and you can see sort of a long chain of islands that extends into the Caribbean. And so this long island chain can be referred to as an archipelago. The other term, isthmus, means a thin link that connects to larger land masses. So much of Central America, especially Panama here, can be considered an isthmus, or a kind of thin link between the continents. And I want to introduce a couple of terms now because we'll be talking about them in future topics. We've talked about agriculture before, and I want to differentiate between subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture. So subsistence agriculture is where food is grown for household use. In other words, you grow it and you eat it, or your family eats it, or maybe your neighboring families eat it as well. And this is historically associated more with African, Asian, and indigenous American land use patterns. That there's been a long history of people growing food to support themselves. In fact, most of human history, that's what farming was. But with the Industrial Revolution came commercial agriculture, and this is where you have large-scale farms where you're not growing the food to eat it, you're growing it to sell it. So these are legacy of the Industrial Revolution and the way land has been distributed in Europe and brought over to the United States and other countries. And this also includes something called plantations. So plantations, which were associated with slavery, but these are going to be a type of commercial agriculture that we're going to find. You may be familiar with cotton plantations in the United States, in the South, but we're going to see other examples of plantations in Middle America and South America as well.